And that really was how it looked for a very long time. You had small family farms. You had crops, plants, and animals. Ranchers were out there with their cattle and their hats and their horses, and they still are, actually. And I don't want to romanticize pre-World War II farming, because it wasn't always so great, and it wasn't always that environmentally sustainable. De Tocqueville noted that U.S. farmers approached the land with the attitude of capitalists rather than conservationists, which is to say, and the reason was there was so much of it. And if your land got exhausted, you could move somewhere else. It wasn't a precious resource yet. So it was approached in a very profligate way, a very exploitative way. But still, there was a key ecological difference to the agriculture we have. And this was largely a sun-powered, a solar-driven agriculture. The sun fed the crops, the plant crops, through photosynthesis. The crops fed the animals. They grew their own feed for their animals, and the crops fed us. And the animals fed us, and their waste, so-called, was not waste at all, actually. It was a great blessing. Their waste fertilized the crops. So you had a closed nutrient cycle. There was, in fact, no such thing as waste, as in nature. The line between the sun, the farmer, his crops, and your dinner plate was fairly short, direct, and circular. Very few inputs, things taken in from outside. Some seeds, some diesel fuel for the tractor, but most of the fertility was generated on the farm, either by animals or through crop rotations. With the result that in that pre-World War II regime, 1 calorie of fossil fuel energy. Now remember, a calorie is just a unit of energy, right? So you can have calories in a tank of oil or in food. It's the same thing. But 1 calorie of energy from fossil fuel generated on average on that farm 2.3 calories of food. Okay? So you're getting more than you're putting in. How can that be? Well, that's solar energy. That increment between 1 and 2.3 calories is the energy of the sun captured by the plants. It's the only free lunch on the planet, solar energy. And these farms made use of it. So from an ecological point of view, they were highly efficient. One farmer could feed 20 other people. The number of farmers, however, because they could only feed 20 other people, was quite large. There were 30 million farmers in 1900. It represented 38% of the workforce. By 1940, there were still 30 million farmers, but the population was much bigger, and it was only 18% of the workforce. 1960, it was down to 15 million farmers, fell by half, 8.5% of the workforce. And the most recent numbers I saw in 1990, it's down to 2.6% of the workforce, because we made that system, from another point of view, much more efficient. There was a tremendous push after World War II to make farming more productive, to get more food with fewer farmers. And the fewer farmers are a very important part of this story. Why? Why did we need so much more food? Well, there were more mouths to feed, right? After World War II, we had the baby boom, and population was growing very quickly. We also had a population that was a little sick of eating the food they ate during the war. During the war, there had been rationing of sugar, meat, milk, and eggs, and butter. And there was a real desire to satisfy that by producing much more of those things. Rising incomes leads to changing desires and diet, as we're seeing now in China. And there was this push for fewer farmers and more industrial workers. We wanted to move workers into the cities to work in factories. But there's also a very interesting kind of hidden history here, which is that people in the government and industry wanted to shrink the number of farmers simply to shrink the number of farmers. Farmers were really troublesome politically in the Progressive era. They had made common cause with labor, and they were a real threat. And so there's a Walter Karp, an historian I'm very fond of, wrote once, "Since the Civil War at least, the most unruly, the most independent, the most Republican, small r, the most Republican of American citizens have been the small farmers." And you can go back and see, I tell this story in Omnivore's Dilemma, a real concerted effort by the OECD, this organization of big corporations and government leaders, to simply, we need less farmers. They're really too much trouble. So that's why we were doing this. How could we do it? How could we change this system and make it dramatically more productive so we could get by with now less than 2 million farmers? Well, there were a couple different things. I want to take you through 4 important factors. First was technology. One of the really interesting things that happens right after the war is that the war machinery is converted to peacetime uses in these 2 senses. First, we took all the research we had done on nerve gas to kill people, which we were doing, and the Germans were doing, and we converted that into pesticide manufacture. A lot of those chemical compounds are the same, just smaller doses. And then at the same time, we were making munitions, right? Lots of bombs, which are made with ammonium nitrate, or were then. Ammonium nitrate, as it happens, is the same ingredient in fertilizer. It's very explosive, well, some terrorists have discovered. There was actually this oversupply of ammonium nitrate, end of the war, what are we going to do with it? The USDA had a plan. They said, let's just spray it on the forest and help the forest grow. And someone else said, no, let's put it on the farmland. And so at a certain date in 1947, the munitions plant at Muscle Shoals, Alabama, where a lot of this ammonium nitrate was produced, converted from making bombs to making fertilizer for farms. Very important shift. And it's the reason that Vandana Shiva says in a famous line of hers that we're still eating the leftovers of World War II. And in that sense, we are. Research also drove this change. We figured out how to hybridize corn seed. And this happened before World War II, but really sunk a lot of money into hybridizing corn. Corn is easier to hybridize than a lot of crops. You can't hybridize wheat, for example. When you hybridize something, you get a boost in yield, but you also get to control the intellectual property, because if you plant the seed from a hybrid plant, you don't get the same plant. You get one of the parents, which isn't going to be as good. So with that kind of control of the intellectual property, lots of seed companies were willing to invest a fortune in corn and raise the yield. And they did. The yields of corn go up from like 40 bushels an acre to more than 200 bushels an acre in a couple decades. An amazing achievement. But you couldn't do that without fertilizer. That density. The way you make corn more productive is not that each plant still has like 2 ears of corn, but instead of having, you know, I don't know, a couple hundred plants, you get 30,000 in an acre, you squeeze them. If you go to a cornfield today, you can't walk through it anymore. You used to be able to walk through it. And that's because the plants are so close together because you have enough fertilizer to keep them all fed. Policy also played a very important role. And this, especially through the 60s and the 70s. The USDA, the Department of Agriculture, which really sets the rules for this whole food industry or game that we were talking about, really urged farmers to focus not on many crops, but 1 or 2 crops. Okay? They tried very hard to get, and the famous phrase of the time was plant fence row to fence row, get bigger, get out, consolidate, and go to monoculture. And again, when you go to a monoculture, which is lots of one crop, like corn, you could never do that without fertilizer because you would exhaust your soil. So that's why I think fertilizer, which we don't talk about so much, is the really key technology here in so many ways. President Nixon faced a crisis in the mid-70s. Food price inflation got very high for reasons we don't have to go into, but and he was really worried. And there were protests. There were women in the street protesting the price of butter and eggs in the 70s. And he hired a new agriculture secretary, a brilliant agricultural economist named Earl Butz. And his job was get food prices down. And Butz figured out how to do that by changing the way that we subsidize agriculture. And we switched from a system of price supports to basically hold prices up and support farmers that way to cutting them checks and allowing them to grow as much as they wanted. Before that, we put limits on how much you could grow because growing too much is a huge problem for agriculture.